Casimir IV was one of the most significant monarchs of the 15th century. As Grand Duke of Lithuania from 1440 and King of Poland from 1447 until his death, he ruled Poland and Lithuania in a personal union for nearly half a century. His reign was marked by important military and political achievements. Under Casimir's leadership, the Kingdom of Poland defeated the Teutonic Knights in the 13 Years' War. This action reclaimed the province of Pomerania and effectively ended the Knights' dominance in Prussia permanently. He also sought to maintain and formalize the union between Poland and Lithuania and worked to reclaim other lands that had once belonged to the Polish crown. Through his marriage to Elizabeth of Habsburg and the strategic marriages of their children, Casimir cemented alliances with powerful dynasties across Europe. In his lifetime, he elevated the already influential Jagiellonian dynasty into one of the leading royal houses of the continent. By the end of his reign, Poland-Lithuania had grown into a major power. Casimir was widely respected as a capable ruler, and his legacy endured long after his passing. However, as it turned out, there would be a much more eerie legacy tied to his final resting place. Casimir IV died on June 7, 1492, and was laid to rest with great honor in Wawel Cathedral in Krakow. His tomb, a red marble sarcophagus topped by an ornate sculpted effigy of the king, was a masterpiece crafted by the renowned German sculptor Veit Stoss around the late 1490s. For centuries, this tomb in the Holy Cross Chapel of Wawel Cathedral remained sealed and undisturbed, holding the remains of Casimir IV and his wife Elizabeth. The king's effigy on the sarcophagus lid depicts him in grand regalia. Generations of visitors to Wawel could view the exterior of Casimir's splendid tomb monument, but none had seen inside it since the early 16th century. That would change in the 1970s, when a team of researchers gained permission to open the tomb, unwittingly setting the stage for a modern legend about a king's curse. In the early 1970s, the cathedral undertook restoration work on the Holy Cross Chapel, where Casimir's tomb is located. As part of this project, church authorities made a momentous decision. They granted permission to open Casimir's tomb for the first time in nearly 480 years. In May 1973, Archbishop Karol Wojtyla of Krakow, better known to the world later as Pope John Paul II, officially authorized a team of experts to unseal the tomb and examine its contents. For the archaeologists and the rest of the team involved, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to study the remains of a major historical figure. On the morning of May 7, 1973, the stone sarcophagus was carefully opened by a crew of 12 researchers under the watchful eye of church officials. Inside, they found the decaying wooden coffins and skeletal remains of King Casimir and Queen Elizabeth, along with fragments of the burial garments and artifacts that had survived the centuries. Little did they know they were unleashing a very real burial curse upon themselves. The immediate goal of the project was to document and preserve the contents of the royal tomb. The remains were studied, the tomb interior was cleaned and stabilized, and plans were made to prevent further deterioration. Once this conservation work was completed, the royal remains were to be reverently reburied. Indeed, a few months later, on September 18, 1973, a reinterment ceremony took place. The bones of Casimir and his queen were placed back into the sarcophagus, which was then resealed in the cathedral crypt. Everything about the excavation and reburial had proceeded according to plan. From a scientific and religious standpoint, it was a successful endeavor that combined historical curiosity with pious care for the deceased. Yet, in the months following the tomb's opening, a series of tragic events unfolded that no one had anticipated, casting a dark shadow over the project. Not long after Casimir's tomb was opened and the bodies were reinterred, members of the research and conservation team began to fall gravely ill or die under sudden, unexplained circumstances. The pattern emerged within a year of the tomb's disturbance. The first to die was the project's leading architect, who suffered a stroke in early 1974 and passed away. Soon after, the chief conservator at Wawel also died, reportedly of a similar cause. These deaths were alarming, but at first they might have been written off as tragic coincidences. Then a third member of the team, the head of the archaeological division, died unexpectedly, followed by another. Within about 2 years of the tomb's opening, 4 of the 12 team members had died prematurely. Ultimately, 10 of the 12 experts who had entered Casimir's tomb in 1973 died within a relatively short period after the project. Many of these individuals were middle-aged and had been in decent health. As news of the researchers' fate spread, the media and public began to whisper about a curse of Casimir. Observers couldn't help but draw parallels to the famous legend of Tutankhamun's curse in Egypt. In what would become a famous event, several members of Howard Carter's 1922 expedition died shortly after entering King Tut's tomb. The Polish press and international outlets picked up on the sensational story. A centuries-old king, disturbed in his resting place, seemingly exacting vengeance on those who had violated his tomb. The fact that the individual who had overseen the tomb opening became Pope John Paul II in 1978 significantly heightened global interest in the story in later years. Within a decade of the tomb's opening, as many as 15 people connected to the project had died according to some counts. This larger figure includes not only the original 12-man team, but also other personnel who handled the remains or artifacts. Whether the number was 10 or 15, it was clear that an unusually high proportion of those involved had met an untimely end. Some reportedly suffered respiratory ailments or infections, while others, as noted, died of sudden strokes or unexplained health failures. The clustering of these incidents in the aftermath of the tomb's disturbance led many to conclude that the curse was real. Family members of the deceased experts were left searching for answers, and the public imagination filled in the blanks with talk of divine punishment or mystical retribution. But even as the curse lore gained traction, scientists were hard at work investigating a more earthly culprit behind the deaths. In the months following the team members' deaths, samples were taken from inside Casimir's tomb and analyzed by microbiologists. Their investigation revealed something striking: the presence of an unusual fungus lurking in the stale air and dust of the sarcophagus. A Polish microbiologist ended up identifying spores of Aspergillus flavus, a toxic mold, in the tomb's environment. It appeared that this fungus had been growing on the decayed organic materials, such as the wooden coffin fragments, or even the royal garments, in the sealed chamber. Once the tomb was opened in 1973, millions of microscopic spores were released into the air, directly exposing the explorers who breathed them in. Far from being an ancient curse in the spiritual sense, the tomb might have unleashed a deadly biological agent, a curse of toxic mold. In the case of Casimir's tomb, the theory is that the investigators, upon opening the coffin, inhaled a concentrated dose of dormant spores that had accumulated over centuries. Fungal spores can remain viable for astonishing lengths of time in sealed crypts, with some research indicating such spores can lie dormant for hundreds of years. Sudden exposure to fresh air and human presence likely stirred up a cloud of invisible spores inside the tight confines of the coffin. Several of the scientists who worked in or around the open tomb later developed acute respiratory illnesses, consistent with severe fungal infections. In other words, What looked like a mystical curse was probably just a simple run-of-the-mill case of a medieval lethal biohazard unleashed upon researchers. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to like, subscribe, and share this video with the history fans in your life. In the middle of the 9th century, a Varangian Viking chieftain named Rurik is said to have been invited to rule over the restless towns of the Eastern Slavs. According to medieval chronicles, this event in the year 862 marked the birth of a new dynasty and the genesis of the polity that would eventually become the powerful Kievan Rus. For centuries, the tale of Rurik's arrival has been repeated as the founding legend of Russia. But was Rurik truly a historical person, or a figure of legend created to explain the origins of the first Russian state? The primary source for Rurik's story is the Russian Primary Chronicle, also called the Tale of Bygone Years, a history compiled by monks under Rurikid patronage in the early 12th century. This chronicle recounts that in the year 862, several East Slavic and Finnic tribes, tired of constant strife, decided to invite a wise foreign prince to rule over them. To ensure neutrality, they wanted a man from far away, who had no existing affiliations with the tribes, and wouldn't exhibit any inherent favoritism. The prince they summoned was Rurik, leader of a Norse tribe known as the Rus, who would give their name to the region and to the largest group of East Slavic people. According to the account, Rurik arrived with his brothers Cineas and Truvor and a large retinue, and the three divided authority among themselves. The oldest, Rurik, located himself at Novgorod, while the two others took over lesser towns in the region. Within a few years, Cineas and Truvor had both died, and Rurik consolidated their lands under his sole rule. Rurik's base of power was in the Novgorod region, near the Volkhov River. One variant of the chronicle tradition even claims that Rurik first settled at Staraya Ladoga, an important Viking trade settlement on Lake Ladoga, before moving to Novgorod. These details suggest that the chroniclers linked Rurik with known Viking enclaves of the time. Indeed, archaeological discoveries show that Staraya Ladoga had a strong Scandinavian presence by the 9th century, and perhaps even as early as the 8th century. Norse-style artifacts associated with Norse gods, and hoards of Persian silver coins have all been found there. These are proof that a Viking network was well established before Rurik's purported arrival. Such evidence makes it plausible that a Varangian leader like Rurik could have seized control of Ladoga and Novgorod in the mid-800s. The chronicle portrays Rurik's rule as legitimate and consensual. The tribes allegedly chose him to govern. Modern historians, however, approach this claim with skepticism. The Primary Chronicle was written over 2 centuries after Rurik's time, and had a political motive to legitimize the ruling dynasty of its author's era. It's likely that reality was messier, and perhaps Rurik was a warlord who took power by force, or arrived as a hired commander, and then usurped authority. The idea that the Slavs and Finns peacefully called a foreign prince may be partly a legend to justify why Norsemen found themselves ruling the region. That said, there are numerous examples of foreign princes being invited to rule regions in the medieval period, though these come from feudal societies rather than tribal ones. According to the chronicles, Rurik ruled in the north until his death, traditionally pinned in the year 879. After this, his kinsman Prince Oleg became regent for Rurik's young son Igor. Prince Oleg wielded substantial power and subsequently expanded the territory dramatically. In 882, Oleg led an expedition south, captured the city of Kiev from other Viking lords, and declared it the new capital of a united Varangian realm. This act joined the northern and southern centers and is often regarded as the formal beginning of the Kievan Rus' state. Oleg and later Igor, who reigned as Grand Prince from 912 to 945, thus cemented what Rurik had begun. They had successfully established a dynastic rule over a federation of East Slavic tribes stretching from Novgorod to Kiev. The dynasty that sprang from Rurik's line, the Rurikids, would continue to govern these lands for centuries. Rurik's descendants, through Igor and beyond, became the princes of Kiev and later the Grand Princes of Vladimir and Moscow, tracing their lineage back to the Varangian founder. This Rurikid dynasty remained in power until 1598, when the last Tsar of Rurik's bloodline died. While the main branch of the Rurikids died with Fyodor I, Vasily IV spent some years as a claimant to the Tsardom during the times of trouble. Rurik's story has figured prominently in the historic debate between Normanist and anti-Normanist schools of thought. The Normanist view holds that the founders of the early East Slavic states, Rurik and his followers, were Norsemen who imported their leadership and helped form the early state. The anti-Normanist perspective, on the other hand, downplays or denies the Varangians' role, insisting that the East Slavs' development didn't depend on outsiders. In earlier centuries, this debate often had nationalistic overtones, as some Russian historians were reluctant to acknowledge that a Viking from abroad could have founded the Russian state. Today, evidence strongly favors the Normanist position. Multidisciplinary research, including archaeology and linguistics, confirms a significant Scandinavian presence in the 9th century East Slavic lands. Most modern historians conclude that the Varangians were indeed Norsemen who became a ruling elite and gradually assimilated with Eastern Slavs over the following centuries. The Normanist theory is now mainstream, whereas modern anti-Normanist claims are generally regarded as historical revisionism, driven more by ideology than by evidence. In other words, while the exact degree of Norse influence can be debated, the mainstream scholarly consensus acknowledges a Scandinavian origin for Rurik and the early Rus' leadership. Even accepting the Norse contribution, historians continue to debate the historicity of Rurik himself. The chronicles are our only direct source on Rurik's life, and they mix factual events with legend. Some scholars have treated Rurik as an actual chief who really did rule Novgorod, while suspecting that the tales of his brothers, Cineas and Truvor, were mythical additions. Other scholars have argued that Rurik was a largely legendary figure, a convenient fiction to personify the establishment of Varangian rule. Under this theory, Vikings did establish rule in the region, but there was no individual named Rurik. The true founder of the Varangian states in the era were lost to time, and the later chroniclers simply invented tales which broadly conformed to what they knew of history. Some have even tried to equate Rurik with Rurik of Dorestad, a 9th century Viking documented in Western Europe. The theory that Rurik of Dorestad and Rurik of Novgorod were the same person is built on circumstantial but compelling evidence. The strongest argument comes from the chronological overlap. Rurik, a Danish Viking who ruled parts of Frisia under Frankish overlordship, is last mentioned in Western European records around 873. Around this same time, Rurik is said to have begun ruling in Novgorod, according to the primary chronicle, which places his arrival in 862. Rurik's sudden disappearance from Frankish sources and Rurik's sudden appearance in Eastern ones have led some to see a possible connection. Also, it's notable that the years are less than 10 years off from one another. This can be explained by the Western sources on Rurik being contemporary, while the primary chronicle came much later. The names themselves are also noteworthy, and Rurik are considered variants of the same Old Norse name. Another clue lies in Rurik's known background. He had extensive experience as a ruler under the Carolingians and would have been familiar with managing tribute, diplomacy, and warfare. These are the very skills Rurik is described as bringing to the fragmented Slavic and Finnic tribes in Eastern Europe. The primary chronicle claims local tribes invited Rurik and his kin to bring order, something a politically seasoned figure like Rurik could plausibly have done. Still, there are limitations, and the primary chronicle doesn't explicitly link Rurik to Novgorod or mention Frisia at all. Further, we generally like to view the Viking world as segmented, viewing what was going on in the Volga region and Eastern Europe as being separate from Western Europe. This is a view that some historians believe wouldn't have been adopted by Norse people themselves. Norse adventurers traveled long distances routinely. In this light, the idea that a Norseman could serve the Carolingians as a vassal and then subsequently establish a tribal kingdom in Eastern Europe isn't implausible. All that said, most historians view the Rurik theory as interesting and speculative, but ultimately impossible to prove based on the present evidence. Further archaeological evidence, such as a find indicating some sort of link between Frisia and Novgorod, may enhance this possibility, depending on what the evidence is. In light of such perspectives, Rurik is best described as a semi-legendary founding figure, based on the evidence as it presently stands. The general consensus is that it's most likely there was a real Viking leader in the 9th century who established himself around Novgorod. While he may not have been named Rurik or done the exact things Rurik did, somebody did something extremely similar. In that sense, Rurik most certainly exists, even if he would be puzzled if you referred to him by that name.